My sister has been lying about me for 30 years. Not occasionally. Not in moments of anger or jealousy that she later regretted. Consistently, deliberately, and with the particular skill of someone who discovered early that she was very good at it, and that the people around her were willing to believe her. She lied about small things first, the way siblings do when they are children, testing the boundaries of what they can get away with. She lied about who broke the vase in the hallway. She lied about who had eaten the last of something in the refrigerator. She lied about what had been said in conversations that only the two of us had been present for. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of things that, taken individually, mean nothing. But she was not doing ordinary things. She was practicing. She was learning. With the instinct of someone naturally gifted at a particular skill, that the key to being believed was not the content of what you said, but the consistency of how you said it. That if you said something calmly, with sadness rather than anger, with concern rather than accusation, if you positioned yourself always as the worried one, the confused one, the one who simply didn't understand why the other person behaved the way they did, people would believe you. Our parents believed her. Our extended family believed her. Our family friends believed her. The neighbors believed her. Teachers believed her. Later, her friends believed her. Later still, her husband believed her. Everyone believed Diane. For 30 years, everyone believed Diane. What none of them knew, what Diane herself did not know, because if she had known she would have behaved very differently, is that I had been keeping records. Not from the beginning. I want to be honest about that. I did not begin recording and documenting when we were children or teenagers or even young adults. I began when I was 34 years old, after a specific incident that I will tell you about, when I finally understood that what I was dealing with was not a difficult sister, but something more deliberate and more damaging than that, and that the only way to protect myself from it was to have something she could not rewrite. I kept records for 11 years, and at my mother's funeral on a gray Tuesday in November, when Diane stood up in front of 200 people and told a story about me that was not true, I was ready. This is that story. I need to start with our childhood, because the childhood is where Diane built the foundation of everything that came after. We grew up in a house that was, by most measures, ordinary, a middle-class family in a mid-sized city. Our father worked in insurance. Our mother taught elementary school until we were old enough not to need her home, and then she went back to teaching and never stopped. We were not wealthy, and we were not poor. We had a house with a yard and 2 bedrooms that we shared until Diane was 12, and our parents converted the study into a 3rd bedroom so we could have our own spaces. There were 2 of us. Diane was 3 years older. 3 years is a significant gap when you are children. It is enough of a gap that the older child has an established position in the family before the younger one arrives. An established relationship with the parents, an established set of expectations, an established understanding of how things work. Diane had 3 years of being the only child before I came along and disrupted the arrangement. I do not think she ever fully forgave me for that. I do not think she was even consciously aware of it. But I think it is where everything began, in that specific, primal resentment of the child who had the parents' complete attention and then suddenly did not. What made Diane remarkable, and I use that word in its most neutral sense, was how early she understood that the way to manage this situation was not to compete with me for our parents' attention, but to reframe me entirely in their perception. Not to be better than me, but to make me worse. Not to shine more brightly, but to dim my light. She started, as I said, with small things. The broken vase was the first one I remember clearly. I was 5, which means she was 8. The vase had been knocked off the hallway table. I still don't know by which of us, genuinely, though I suspect it was her. And when our mother came to see what the sound was, Diane looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following 30 years. Sad, concerned, confused, as though she herself couldn't understand why I had done what I had done. She said, "I don't know, Mom. I was just walking by and she knocked it over." I said, "I didn't." My mother looked at the two of us. She looked at me, 5 years old, newly in trouble, face hot with the particular injustice of being blamed for something I hadn't done. And she looked at Diane, 8 years old, calm, sad, concerned. She believed Diane. Of course she believed Diane. Diane was calm and I was upset. And in the visual grammar of childhood conflict, the upset one is the guilty one. This is something Diane understood at 8 years old with an instinctive precision that I did not develop the language to name until I was in my 30s. The upset one looks guilty. The calm one looks innocent. Diane was always calm. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern was established. I was the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who overreacted, who misunderstood, who caused problems where Diane caused none. I was the one our parents worried about, not because I had done anything to warrant that worry, but because Diane had, over years, created a version of me in their minds that required worrying about. She did this with extraordinary subtlety. She never said directly, "She is difficult." She said things like, "I just worry about her sometimes. She seems like she's struggling." She said things like, "I tried to talk to her about it, but she got so upset, I don't know what I said wrong." She said things like, "I just wish I understood her better. I feel like no matter what I do, she's angry at me." Every one of these statements positioned Diane as caring, concerned, trying, and positioned me as volatile, unreachable, ungrateful for her efforts. Our parents absorbed these statements the way you absorb information from a trusted source. They did not question them because they had no reason to question them. Diane was the good one. Diane was the reliable one. Diane had never given them any reason not to trust her completely. I gave them reason all the time, apparently, though the reasons were always Diane's inventions, and I could never prove it. And the more upset I became when trying to defend myself, the more my upset seemed to confirm exactly what she had been saying about me. It was a closed loop. Every attempt I made to exit it pushed me further in. By the time I left for college at 18, I was genuinely uncertain about my own perception of events. That is the thing that nobody tells you about growing up in proximity to someone like Diane. The damage is not just to your reputation. It is to your relationship with your own mind. When the people around you consistently believe a version of events that contradicts your experience of those same events, you begin, eventually, to doubt yourself. I doubted myself for a long time. I left for college, and I did not come back except for holidays and the occasional family event that could not be avoided. I built a life at a careful distance from Diane, not because I had named what she was doing, not yet, but because proximity to her left me feeling scraped out and uncertain in a way that distance relieved. I studied communications. I worked after graduation in marketing for a mid-sized company. I was good at my job. I was promoted. I had friends, a social life, a studio apartment that I loved unreasonably because it was entirely mine. No Diane in it, no family narrative in it, just my own things arranged in my own way. I met a man named Patrick at 31. We were together for 2 years before we married. He was a steady, thoughtful person who had grown up in a large family and had a comfortable relationship with complexity. He knew about Diane from early in our relationship, not the full scope of it, not yet, but enough. The wedding was the first major event that brought my family and my new life into direct contact. Diane was my maid of honor. This had been my mother's suggestion and my decision to accept it, made in the spirit of optimism that I had not yet entirely abandoned, the belief that perhaps, at this stage of our lives, with enough distance between us, Diane and I could manage something that looked like sisterhood. Diane gave a maid of honor speech that was, on the surface, perfectly warm. She talked about our childhood. She talked about memories I did not remember the way she described them. She told a story about a camping trip that positioned me as the anxious, helpless younger sister who had needed Diane to hold her together, and Diane as the patient, capable older sister who had always been there. The room laughed warmly. Patrick squeezed my hand under the table. I smiled through the whole thing. Afterward, my aunt found me in the hallway near the bathrooms and said, "Your sister loves you so much. You can really hear it in how she talks about you." I said, "Yes." I went back to my own wedding reception and I danced with my husband, and I decided, somewhere on that dance floor, that I was done trying to make Diane into something she was not going to be. The incident that changed everything happened when I was 34. Patrick and I had been married for 3 years. We had a house, a dog named Franklin, and a life that I was genuinely happy in for the first time I could clearly remember. I had been promoted to director of marketing at my company. We were talking carefully and with hope about starting a family. My mother called me on a Thursday evening in March. She was upset. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was trying to be measured about something that was actually distressing her considerably. She said she needed to talk to me about something she had heard. She said Diane had told her that I had called Diane's husband, a man named Gregory, and said things to him about Diane that were, in my mother's careful phrasing, very concerning. I said, "What things?" My mother said Diane had told her I had called Gregory and told him that Diane had a drinking problem she was hiding from him, and that I was worried about the effect it was having on their marriage. I sat very still on my end of the phone. I said, "I have never called Gregory in my life. I don't have his phone number. I have spoken to him at family events, in your presence, and Diane's presence, and never otherwise." My mother said, "Diane says you called from a blocked number." I said, "Mom, I did not call Gregory. I have never called Gregory. Whatever Diane told you, she invented it." There was a long pause. My mother said, in the gentle, pained voice of someone trying to be fair, "I just don't understand why she would say it if it wasn't true." And there it was. The same sentence in different forms that had been the architecture of my entire childhood. I just don't understand why she would say it if it wasn't true, as though the only universe in which Diane spoke was the universe in which she was telling the truth, as though the alternative, that Diane had fabricated an entire phone call, an entire conversation, entirely from nothing, was too improbable to seriously consider. I hung up the phone after a few more minutes of getting nowhere. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Patrick came in and found me there and asked what had happened, and I told him, and he sat across from me and listened and then said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "You know what the problem is? You've never had anything she couldn't just call your word against hers." I looked at him. He said, "What if you did?" I want to be precise about what I did and did not do, because I think precision matters here. I did not begin recording Diane secretly in all situations. I did not tap her phone or access her messages or put any device in her home. What I did was far simpler and far less dramatic and entirely legal in my jurisdiction, where only one party to a conversation needs to consent to its being recorded, and I was always that party. I began recording my conversations with Diane. Every phone call from March of my 34th year onward. Recorded, filed, labeled with date and summary. I also began keeping a written record. After every interaction with Diane, in person, by phone, by text, I wrote down exactly what had been said, in as much detail as I could recall within an hour of it happening. I noted who else had been present. I noted the context. I noted what had been said before and after. I did this not because I had a plan. I had no plan. I did it because Patrick was right. I had spent 30 years with nothing but my own word, and my own word had consistently been measured against Diane's word and found less credible, and I was no longer willing to operate that way. I kept the records in a folder on a cloud account that only I had access to. I backed them up. I organized them by year and by incident. By the time 11 years had passed, I had a document that was, in its totality, a comprehensive and thoroughly sourced account of 30 years of a pattern, with the last 11 years recorded in real time. I did not tell anyone I was doing this, not Patrick, not my friends, not my therapists, who I had started seeing at 35 and who had helped me over years to name what I had been living with and to stop doubting my own perception of it. I kept the records and I waited and I went on with my life. The years between 34 and 45 were, in many ways, the best of my life. Patrick and I had 2 children, a daughter named Clara and a son named James, 3 years apart, both of them entirely themselves. From the first moment and entirely beloved. I was promoted twice more at work, eventually becoming VP of marketing for a company I had helped grow from 60 employees to nearly 300. We bought a larger house. We got a second dog because Franklin was lonely. We built a life that was full and specific and mine in a way that nothing had been mine when I was growing up in Diane's shadow. I saw my family at Christmas and Thanksgiving and the occasional birthday. I managed my parents with warmth and care and the particular skill of an adult child who loves her parents and also knows how to maintain appropriate distance from a situation that has never been fully safe. I saw Diane at these events, and I was civil and warm, and I recorded every phone call, and I filed every incident. Diane in these years continued to be Diane. She told my mother I had forgotten her birthday 2 years in a row when I had not. She told my aunt that Patrick and I were having serious marital problems when we were not. She told a family friend that I had been passed over for a promotion at work due to performance issues, when in fact I had received the promotion and a significant raise. She told Gregory, who I had still, in 11 years, never called, that I had spread rumors about her at a family gathering, a gathering at which I had not been present. Every one of these conversations found its way back to me eventually, through the network of family and family-adjacent people through whom information travels in extended families, always slightly distorted by the journey, always carrying Diane's framing. Every one of them went into the record. I did not confront her about any of them. I had learned definitively that confrontation with Diane was a game I could not win. Every confrontation became evidence of my volatility and her victimhood, another data point in the portrait she had been painting for 30 years. I did not play that game anymore. I simply kept the record, and I waited. My father died first, at 73, a stroke that was mercifully fast. He was gone within 48 hours of the hospital call, without regaining consciousness, in the particular clean and devastating way of strokes that spare the person who dies the worst of it, and give all of it to the people left behind. I flew home immediately. I stayed for 2 weeks. I helped plan the funeral, helped settle the immediate practical matters, helped my mother move through the first weeks of a house that was suddenly too quiet. Diane was also there, of course. Diane managed the funeral arrangements in the particular way she managed everything, by being visibly in charge, visibly capable, visibly the one holding things together. She accepted condolences on behalf of the family with a warmth and composure that people consistently commented on. She organized. She directed. She positioned herself, as she always had, as the capable one, the reliable one, the one who held the family together. I did what needed doing, and I did not fight for credit for it, and I went home to Patrick and the children, and Franklin and the second dog, whose name was Biscuit, because Clara had insisted, and we had all agreed it was a good name. My mother was different after my father died, quieter, smaller somehow, in the way that people become smaller when the person they have organized their life around is no longer in it. She called more often. She visited twice a year. She talked about my father constantly, which I encouraged, because talking about him seemed to be what she needed. She also talked about Diane constantly, which I managed with less enthusiasm, but consistent patience. My mother had moved, in the years since my father's death, further into Diane's orbit. This was perhaps inevitable. Diane lived 40 minutes from my mother, I lived 4 hours away, and proximity is a powerful force in family dynamics. Diane had positioned herself as the devoted local daughter, the one who checked in regularly and brought groceries and drove my mother to appointments, and was there in all the daily, visible ways that I, at 4 hours' distance, could not be. I knew what Diane was doing with this position. I knew that proximity was being used as currency, that every grocery run was an investment, that every appointment was a demonstration, that the devotion was real in the sense that it was genuinely performed but constructed in the specific way that Diane constructed everything, with an eye toward what it built in other people's perceptions. I knew this. I filed it. I continued to call my mother twice a week and visit 6 times a year, and be, as best I could from 4 hours away, a present and loving daughter. And I kept the record. My mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia when she was 78. I want to be careful how I tell this part, because my mother was not a villain in this story. She was a woman who had loved both her daughters as best she could with the tools she had, and who had been, for 30 years, given consistently false information about one of them by the other, and who had no reason to doubt the source. She was a woman who had done her best. The dementia was not a punishment, and she did not deserve it, and it was, in the final year of her life, the thing I hated most in a life that had given me several things to hate. When the diagnosis came, the question of care became immediate and practical. My mother needed more support than she had been receiving. She needed someone to be present in a more structured and comprehensive way. Diane and I had a phone call, recorded, in which we discussed the options. Diane said she was, of course, willing to do whatever was needed. She said she had always been there for Mom and would continue to be. She said she was concerned in her careful way about whether I would be able to contribute meaningfully given my distance. I said I would cover the cost of additional professional care, a home aide 3 days a week, and would increase my visits to monthly. Diane said that sounded like a good arrangement. The arrangement worked for about 6 months. The home aide was excellent. My mother's needs were being met. I visited every month and called twice a week and did what I could from 4 hours away. Then, in the spring, Diane called me with a different tone than her usual tone, tighter, more managed. She said she thought we needed to discuss the estate. I said we could discuss whatever needed discussing. She said she had been talking to an attorney. Not a word about which attorney. Not a word about when this had started. And that given the circumstances, given the differences in proximity and contribution, she thought it would be fair to revisit how the estate was structured. I said, "What does Mom currently have in her will?" Diane said the current will split everything equally between us. I said, "And what are you proposing instead?" There was a pause. She said she thought a 70-30 split would be more reflective of the reality of the situation. I understood what was happening. I had understood it before she finished the sentence. Diane was proposing to use our mother's declining capacity and her own proximity, the proximity she had built strategically over years, to restructure the inheritance in her favor, framed as fairness, framed as reflecting contribution, framed in the language of reasonable adult children making practical decisions. I said, "I'll need to speak to Mom directly about this." Diane said, "She's not really in a position to have complicated conversations, you know that." I said, "I'll speak to her attorney then." The call ended shortly after. I called my mother's attorney the following morning. The attorney informed me that my mother had, 3 weeks earlier, been visited by Diane and had signed a document amending her will. The amendment reduced my share from 50% to 20% and increased Diane's to 80%. I asked whether my mother had had independent legal counsel at the time of signing. There was a pause. The attorney said the signing had been arranged by Diane and that he had been present, but that the conversation had been primarily between Diane and my mother. I asked whether my mother had been assessed for capacity at the time of signing. Another pause. I thanked the attorney and I hung up. Then I called my own attorney, a woman named Christine who specialized in elder, law, and estate litigation, and I told her everything, including the 11 years of records, including the recordings, including the documented pattern of behavior of which this amendment was simply the most recent and most legally significant example. Christine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How complete are these records?" I said, "Comprehensive." She said, "I need to see all of it." I sent her everything that week. My mother died in November, 8 months after the will amendment. She died at home, in her own bed, on a Tuesday morning, with the home aide present and Diane, who had arrived the night before in the house. I had been called when she declined significantly and had driven through the night to be there, arriving at 4 a.m, sitting with her through the final hours. She died at 7:43 in the morning. I held her hand. Whatever had been complicated between us, whatever Diane had built in the space between us over 30 years, was not present in that room at that hour. What was present was a mother and a daughter, and the specific, irreducible love that exists between them regardless of everything else. I held her hand until it was over. The funeral was 3 days later. 200 people came. My mother had taught elementary school for 30 years and had, in those 30 years, accumulated the kind of community that only teachers build. Former students, now in their 30s and 40s, parents of students, colleagues, neighbors, family friends spanning multiple generations. 200 people in a church hall on a gray Tuesday in November, all of them there because my mother had mattered to them. The service was being officiated by the family's longtime pastor. There were several planned speakers. Diane had organized the order of speakers, which I had not objected to, because organizing things was what Diane did, and I had decided, in the days before the funeral, that I was not going to spend my mother's funeral managing Diane. I had not anticipated what Diane was going to do. She was the third speaker. She walked to the front of the room in a black dress, and she stood at the small podium, and she looked out at 200 people who had loved my mother, and she began to speak. The first several minutes were what you would expect. Memories of childhood, my mother's laugh, my mother's cooking, my mother's devotion to her students. Diane was a good speaker. She had always been a good speaker, and the room was warm and attentive, and several people were already crying. And then she said, "I do want to say something, because I think honesty is what Mom would have wanted." The room shifted slightly. The energy changed in the subtle way that energy changes when something unexpected is coming. She said, "The last years of Mom's life were not easy, and I want to acknowledge that there were people who were not there for her the way she needed. People who prioritized other things. People who, when she was most vulnerable, took advantage of that vulnerability rather than showing up." She paused. She looked out at the room. She said, "Mom deserved better than that. And I know, that she knew it. In her final months, when she could still tell me what she was feeling, she told me she felt let down by people she had expected more from. She told me she was grateful that at least one of her daughters had been there. 200 people in a room. Many of them looking at me now. Many of them with the particular expression of people who are receiving information they did not have before and are deciding what to do with it. I sat very still. Patrick's hand found mine under the chair. I looked at Diane at the podium, and I thought about 30 years. I thought about the vase in the hallway. I thought about the camping trip at my wedding. I thought about the phone call she had invented, the problems she had fabricated, the will she had amended while our mother was declining. I thought about 11 years of records. I looked down at my phone in my other hand. I thought about what my mother would have wanted. I thought she would have wanted the truth. After 30 years, she would have wanted the truth. I stood up. The room noticed immediately. 200 people, and the moment I stood up, the attention shifted, the way attention shifts when something breaks from the expected order of events. Diane stopped speaking. She looked at me. I walked to the front of the room. I did not look at Diane. I looked at the 200 people who had loved my mother, and I said, in a voice that I kept very steady, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll be brief. I just need to share something." I held up my phone. I said, "What my sister just described, a daughter who wasn't there, who let our mother down, who took advantage of her vulnerability. I want to play you something. This is a phone call between my sister and me, recorded 8 months ago." Diane said, "You can't." I pressed play. The recording was clear. My voice and Diane's voice, both unmistakable in the conversation about the estate. Diane's voice proposing the 70-30 split. Diane's voice saying our mother was not in a position to have complicated conversations. Diane's voice, in the careful, managed register she had used her entire life, arranging to restructure our mother's estate while our mother was dying. I let it play for 90 seconds. Then I stopped it. I said, "I have 11 years of recordings. I have documentation going back 30 years. My attorney has all of it, and it is currently part of an estate litigation that was filed 6 weeks ago." I paused. I love my mother. I was there with her when she died. I held her hand. Whatever my sister has told you about who was present and who was not, I would encourage you to ask her directly and to consider what you just heard when you evaluate the answer. I looked at Diane. She was standing at the podium and she was completely still, and her face had the expression of someone who has, for the first time in 30 years, run out of options. I said, "I'm sorry for the interruption. Please continue." Then I walked back to my seat. The room was completely silent. I will not tell you that what followed was clean or simple, because it was not. Funerals are not courtrooms. The 200 people who were there went home and processed what they had heard in their own ways, and some of them called me, and some of them called Diane, and some of them said nothing to either of us. Families are not juries. Evidence does not resolve 30 years of established narrative in a single afternoon. But some things shifted, irrevocably. My aunt, my mother's sister, who had known Diane and me our entire lives, called me that evening. She said she had suspected for years. She said she was sorry it had taken this long. She said she was glad the truth had found a room to be in. My mother's oldest friend called me 2 days later and said almost exactly the same thing. 3 cousins reached out over the following week. Not all of them said what I think they actually believed, because families are complicated and loyalty is complicated, and 30 years of narrative does not dissolve overnight. But they reached out. The estate litigation was resolved 7 months later. Christine had built a thorough case. The 11 years of documentation, the recordings, the evidence of a pattern of behavior culminating in the will amendment at a time when my mother's capacity was significantly compromised. The court found in my favor. The will was reverted to its original equal split. Diane did not contest it further after the initial proceedings. I think she understood that contesting it further would require her to argue against the recordings in a forum where the recordings would simply be played again, and that this was not a forum she could manage with suggestion and implication and the careful performance of concern. The equal split was restored. I did not celebrate. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was something more like the particular exhaustion and relief of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally, at the end of a very long road, been able to put it down. I kept one thing from the estate beyond my legal share. Among my mother's belongings, sorted through carefully, over a weekend in January with Patrick beside me, I found a box of photographs. Family photographs going back decades, the 2 of us as children, my parents' wedding, Christmases and summers and ordinary days that had been photographed and saved because someone had understood they mattered. In most of the photographs from our childhood, Diane and I are together. In most of them, Diane is composed, smiling, turned toward the camera with the particular ease of someone who has always known how to present herself. In most of them, I am looking at something else. A dog, a tree, the middle distance. Not performing for the camera, just existing in the moment, unaware that it was being recorded. I looked at those photographs for a long time. I thought about the girl in them, the one looking away, the one who had no idea what was being built around her, the one who would spend 30 years doubting her own perception of events that she had experienced correctly all along. I thought, I wish I could tell her it comes out right in the end. I took the box of photographs home. People ask me, the people who know this story, the small number of people I have told it to, whether I regret waiting so long, whether I wish I had played the recordings earlier, whether 11 years of keeping records while Diane continued to operate freely was worth it, or whether it would have been better, earlier, louder, more confrontational. I have thought about this question carefully. The answer is no. I do not regret waiting. Here is what I know about evidence. Its power is not just in its content, but in its completeness. A single recording played early in a moment of conflict would have been a moment. It would have been disputed, contextualized, explained away. Diane was extraordinarily good at explaining things away. It would have been one data point against 30 years of established narrative. 11 years of records is not a data point. It is a pattern. It is a comprehensive, sourced, documented account of behavior that, when laid out in its entirety, cannot be reframed, cannot be explained away, cannot be positioned as a misunderstanding or an overreaction or the complaint of a volatile, difficult sister who never quite got over her childhood jealousy. Completeness is what made it irrefutable. Patience is what made it complete. I also know this. Every year I kept the records, I was living my life. I was with Patrick. I was raising Clara and James. I was building a career and a home and a community of people who knew me as I actually was, rather than as Diane had described me. The record was not my life. It was a folder on a cloud account that I added to when something happened and then closed. The waiting was not suffering. The waiting was living. And at the end of it, when it mattered most, I was ready. There is something I want to say about the specific experience of growing up as the sister who was not believed. It does something to you that takes years to undo. When the people who are supposed to know you best, your parents, your family, the people who were there, consistently receive a version of you that contradicts your experience of yourself, you begin to wonder which version is real. You begin to question your perceptions, your memories, your instincts. You develop a particular kind of self-doubt that is not about capability or intelligence, but about reality itself, about whether what you experienced was actually what happened. This is, I have come to understand, one of the most insidious forms of harm one person can do to another. Not physical harm, not financial harm, but the slow, consistent undermining of another person's confidence in their own perception, the theft of their certainty about their own experience. It took me years of therapy and distance and the patient accumulation of evidence to trust myself again, to be able to say, I know what happened. I was there. I experienced it correctly. The version of events that contradicts mine is not the true one. I am telling you this because I think it is the most important part of this story. More important than the recordings, more important than the funeral, more important than the estate. The most important thing is this. I was right. I had always been right. The doubt that had been planted in me was not evidence of my instability. It was evidence of Diane's skill. And the moment I understood that, really understood it, in my body and not just my mind, was the moment everything changed. You are not imagining it. If you have been told consistently by someone who presents themselves as knowing you better than you know yourself that your perception of events is wrong, I want you to consider the possibility that your perception is not wrong. Trust yourself, document what you can, and wait. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. But sometimes rising takes 30 years. Sometimes it takes 11 years of a folder on a cloud account. Sometimes it takes patience that other people would call passivity, endurance that other people would call weakness, silence that other people would call surrender. It is none of those things. It is strategy. It is preparation. It is the slow, patient accumulation of truth in a world that has been, for a long time, receiving lies. And when the moment comes, when the room is full and the words have been said and the damage has been attempted for the last time, you press play and you let the truth speak for itself. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment below. I want to know. Have you ever been the sister who wasn't believed? Have you ever been in a room where someone rewrote your story in front of you? Tell me. I read every single one.